Where do files go when the recycle bin is emptied? This is a stupid question. It implies that the universe somehow conserves files, and it doesn't. But sometimes overanalyzing stupid questions can lead to profound insights. So let's see where this one takes us. A file is basically just a sequence of numbers. If you think about it, you can encode any kind of media with just a sequence of numbers. For example, if those numbers represent letters of the alphabet, then a file could be a document. If those numbers represent voltages for your audio speakers to apply an electromagnet that pushes some kind of cone to make compression waves in the air, then the file could be an audio recording. And if those numbers represent pixel colors for some kind of display monitor, then a file could be an image. Sometimes the media we encode in files can be impactful. For example, a document might contain the writings of William Shakespeare. An audio file might contain recordings of the works of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, or an image might contain a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. When media reaches us and stimulates our emotions, it seems to be so much more than just numbers. But is it? Sequences of numbers, of course, can be represented in binary form. That means they can be converted to nothing more than ones and zeros. And ones and zeros can be encoded in many physical forms, such as microscopic holes burned by a laser into the thin metallic foil of a disk, or the modulations of radio signals used by your Wi-Fi router, or in the electrical signals that transmit those files over the wired internet. Yet somehow it seems crass to imply that the great works of Shakespeare, Mozart, and Da Vinci could be reduced to mere physical encodings. Surely the works that reach us and touch us and motivate us deserve immortality. In a sense, these works really are immortal. The very fact that people love them results in innumerable copies. Even if the original works of William Shakespeare were completely destroyed, the love of his works has already permeated throughout society. Sure, you can delete your copy of William Shakespeare's works, but someone will always keep another copy, perhaps in a special corner of the library. Now let's confront an uncomfortable hypothetical. What if every last copy of the works of William Shakespeare, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Leonardo da Vinci were somehow destroyed? Would these previously immortal works just cease to exist? Sometimes people like to imagine there are redundant copies of the most important works in some kind of supernatural realm. They imagine angelic librarians somewhere are cataloging the best works so that humankind will lack the ability to ever completely destroy their own great achievements. This implies a sort of celestial survival of the fittest, where the merits of a creation qualify it to continue to exist. But this makes little sense. Those angels would presumably have superior abilities themselves, and their time would be better spent producing works of their own. Why would the creations of mere humans even warrant the notice of celestial beings? Another silly thought is that perhaps those angels have unlimited storage space, and so they record every last detail of everything. This would imply that every awful song I ever sang in the car on the way to work will survive in perpetuity. But of course, no one would ever waste their time consuming that garbage, so what's the point of storing it? Consider the proverbial tree that falls in the woods. Obviously, the fall creates compression waves that will travel through the air. But what if no one is present to experience those compression waves? Is a sound the waves themselves? Or is it what happens in a mind that experiences those waves? Likewise, if all the information ever produced actually was recorded, but no one ever cared enough to spend time consuming much of it, does the information still live? Some people take comfort in recognizing that consequences tend to ripple outward like waves in a pond. It follows that effects from every bit of information that has ever been transmitted are still emanating outward in space. Perhaps some advanced future alien race may filter through all that information and reassemble lost files. But this will never really happen either. You see, the history of the entire Earth may somehow be encoded in the placement of grains of sand on the seashore, yet no one actually bothers trying to catalog the placement of all those grains of sand. Why not? Because there is just too much information. There are and will always be simpler sources of information more worthy of spending our time on. Thus, even if information may never be completely destroyed, it still ceases to be a candidate for being experienced when it loses relevance and falls into obscurity. And this is the fate of the vast majority of all information. In other words, when you delete a file, it's really gone. There may be traces left on your hard drive platter that a forensic expert could potentially use to reconstruct that file, but the number of deleted files is growing much faster than the number of forensic experts, so the vast majority of it really will be lost forever. And here's where this analysis finally hits home. You are a file. One day, your brain will be disorganized, and you will cease to exist. You may care very deeply about your consciousness, but caring does not preserve a file, copies do. And there is no redundant copy of you. Let's consider the many systems in your physical body. We all know what happens to breathing when the lungs stop respirating. No one supposes spiritual lungs keep respirating spiritual air so the process can continue in another realm. That's just being silly. And we all know what happens to circulation when the heart stops beating. There are no spiritual hearts that continue to pump spiritual blood. And the same thing happens to digestion when the stomach and gut stop digesting. There is no spiritual gut that digests spiritual food to produce spiritual poop. So why are so many people so adamant that their cognition will somehow continue somewhere after their brains stop working? That's really not how things work. Some people have their genomes sequenced, hoping that future generations will have the power to resurrect people from their DNA. But even if a more advanced society really does eventually develop that power, is it reasonable to suppose their priority for using that power would be to bring back a bunch of primitive people who were scared to die? If scientists really could bring back a Tyrannosaurus Rex, would they do it? Of course they would. Any scientist would jump at the chance to study a real Tyrannosaurus Rex. But they are most certainly not going to try to resurrect every tyrannosaur that ever lived and give the entire Earth back to them so that they may rule once again. Other people find solace in recognizing that there are a limited number of possible genomes, so they reason that eventually their DNA is bound to occur again, just by random chance. Unfortunately, there are many problems with this wishful thinking. First, it's based on a very weak understanding of math. The heat death of the entire universe will actually occur long before that ever has a chance to happen. The environment simply will not be reproducing DNA forever. Second, even if it could actually happen, your DNA does not actually contain an encoding of you. All your DNA encodes is the process for forming you in the environment where you are born. Human DNA contains about 3.2 billion nucleotides. That's about 800 megabytes of storage space. But your cerebrum alone is estimated to contain about 100 trillion synaptic connections. Those connections are not encoded in your DNA. They can't be. There's simply not enough room. You are mostly a product of your upbringing in an environment that will never, ever occur again. Third, the continuity created by memories is what gives meaning to our consciousness. Even if versions of you previously occurred many times in the past, they still have no meaning in your present life or value for your identity. Why? Because you simply cannot remember them. Some people get by with the hope that perhaps someday science may cure death. That would certainly be a great achievement. But I think it's important to note that even if humans never died, they would still lack the capacity to experience an immortal life. You see, human brains have a property called neuroplasticity. It describes how quickly our brains can adapt to learn new things. When we are young, our neuroplasticity is very high. This enables us to learn quickly, but it also means we forget much of what we experience too. When we are old, our neuroplasticity is lower. This preserves our experiences and memories much better, but it also has the effect of making us slow to adapt. Our own experiences have less impact on us than they used to. So what level of neuroplasticity would be suitable for an immortal being? If it were very high, then he would live within a narrow sliding window of memory, perpetually forgetting the distant past, and if it were low, then he would be hardened against his own experiences. He would live in a numb oblivion, unable to even experience his own immortality. What a waste. So even if we could achieve immortality, the only way to really experience it would require changing how our brains work. There is no known way for a continuum of memories to span an eternity, and if we must change how our brains work, is it really even us that has achieved immortality? Perhaps we might say that changing our brains is the closest we can get to immortality, so we'll just be content letting beings that are not quite us experience that immortality. But if we're willing to accept that, then why not simply admit that this is the situation human society already finds itself in? You see, every human being is essentially a slight variation of you. Other people do not have your memories, their brains grew under slightly different conditions, and there are very slight genetic differences between individuals. But for the most part, we are all very similar. Our similarities far exceed our differences, so is it even wrong to look at the people you interact with as variations of yourself with slightly different experiences? I'll even take it a step further and argue that there is something very good and right about doing that. Let's consider some patterns we see in living things in nature. Your body is made up of individual cells. Each cell has a life of its own, but it's much shorter than yours. When cells die, they are replaced, and your life, which is made up of all of their lives, continues on. Your life is a literal ship of Theseus, reconstructed out of new parts every decade or so. You might ask, why do individual cells work so very hard to sustain your life? What are they living for? Do they imagine that if they work really hard and do what good cells do, that some cell god will reward them in a cell afterlife where they can continue being cell-like for all eternity? Probably not. But regardless of what reason they may find for doing what they do, their behavior is what gives you life. They are not just lone individual organisms, they are part of something greater than themselves. And that something, you, will continue to live after they die. Sometimes humans have a tendency to forget that they are more than just individuals. When a person becomes excessively wrapped up in himself, death becomes terrifying. It is an inevitable force that is coming to take away everything that an egocentric person cares about. And that is a recipe for descending into depressed nihilism. But the solution is simple. Stop being egocentric. The universe is not all about you, and you are not just an individual. You are so much more than that. So live for something greater than yourself, something that will continue to live after you die. If you do that, then death is nothing to worry about. It's just a retirement. It's when you pass your load on to the next generation and let the young versions of you, who are full of neuroplasticity and vigor for life, carry on working for those things that you have always cared about more than yourself. I always get a certain sense of satisfaction when I empty the recycle bin and contemplate those files just ceasing to exist.